You can imagine asking the question, do you like living in America? And that is kind of a far too broad question. Um, if you asked me, do you like living in America? I'd say, yes, I do. This is my homeland. This is the place I'm familiar with. This is a land that I love. Of course, I love living in America. But that doesn't mean that I would want to live in every single place in America, that I'd be completely indifferent to where in America I lived. So you might ask, do you like your living arrangements right now? And I'd say, well, they're fine, but this is one of the least favorite places that I've ever lived in. I don't like living in downtown Fargo where I constantly get woken up by drunks at 2 o'clock in the morning after the bars close. There's bars just down the street from us. Quite consistently, I get woken up by them hooting and hollering about somebody. And if you concluded from that I don't like living in the United States of America, I'd say, hold on, buddy, this is just a temporary arrangement for me. I do actually prefer to live here in my homeland, here in the United States of America. It's just this particular place in America is not my favorite, even though it's fine. And out of all my complaints, they're fairly minor, but there would be places that I would prefer to live and places that I would prefer not to live, all within the same place in the United States of America. Because it's so big, obviously, we need to get at the correct level of analysis in order to understand whether or not I like where I happen to be living at any particular moment. And I get the same kind of feeling when I get asked about Vatican II. Do you like Vatican II? Um, and that's not necessarily an entirely useless question, but it's hard for me to just give it straight thumbs up and thumbs down. Uh, it was actually quite a big thing, and it's actually a thing that has had a profound impact on the church in many, many different levels of detail. So I think it needs to be handled with a fair bit of nuance and a fair bit of sorting things out. But I will say that on the whole, I do really like Vatican II. So what are we talking about? We're talking about an ecumenical council that happened in the 20th century. Pope John the 23rd announced that he was convoking an ecumenical council in 1959. And somehow they were able to get that thing off the ground by 1962. October of 1962 is when they began meeting. And this was a massive undertaking. It was in every Catholic bishop in the world was invited to it, and most of them came for at least some of it. There were some who maybe were too ill or had to leave early to attend to important things, but for most of the sessions, they had a good number of bishops from all around the world. That came out to over 2,000 at times, not to mention people in supporting and auxiliary roles, and people who were invited as experts, and people who were invited as observers. Even non-Catholics were invited to participate as observers. Now, one of the main things that Vatican I needed to do was to finish, the Vatican II needed to do was to finish the work of Vatican I, which was interrupted. In the 19th century, Vatican I had much more ambitious goals, which were interrupted by a war and never finished. So it met in 4 sessions between 1962 and 1965 and produced 16 different documents, which were voted on by all of the bishops present and passed, most of them by an overwhelming majority. So they represented a consensus position, not just of what the Holy Father was thinking, but what bishops all around the world were thinking. These 16 different documents affected life on every level of the church. But there's a problem with the perception of Vatican II. The document on the liturgy was by far the most visible of the documents. not in terms of the most people had read it, but the most people had seen the effects and the after effects of the document on the liturgy more than anything else. And this is quite natural. We should assume that this is the case because this is what people all throughout the world would have actually experienced when it comes to Vatican II. This changed the way that Mass was celebrated in every Latin Rite parish throughout the world. So when people ask you about Vatican II, they probably implicitly just mean the liturgical changes. And, that was easily the most controversial thing for the average Catholic in the pew to come out of the Second Vatican Council. Now, Sacrosanctum Concilium was promulgated, I think, in 1963. And it gave kind of general directions and some rather general things to be done by the Curia, by the writings of by the dicasteries of the Roman Curia. The actual liturgical books never got put to a vote from the bishops. The general instruction of the Roman Missal and the Ordo Missae, changes to the Mass came out, were first promulgated in 1969 and first implemented in 1970. That was 5 years after the conclusion of the last session of the Second Vatican Council. So it can certainly be interpreted and argued about whether or not the Roman Curia and the various people tasked with the reform of the liturgy actually followed through on what the bishops were expecting, what the bishops were anticipating. And I don't intend to really dive into that in this video. See, my main worry is that some people will miss really important things that Vatican II accomplished in the fog of war from the liturgy wars. Vatican II actually accomplished some really important things, which we should want to hold on to, even if we still have questions about the liturgy wars and the reform of the liturgy and those sorts of things. And so I'm going to talk about a few things. I'm going to talk about church governments, church-state relationships, ecumenical dialogue, and interreligious relationships. These are all things that were covered by Vatican II, that were accomplished by Vatican II, that I think are good for the church, and I think are things that ought not to be forgotten about or dismissed. And you're going to have to prepare yourself for a fair amount of canon law here. The 1983 Code of Canon Law is called by some the last document of Vatican II. And as far as I'm concerned, nobody implemented Vatican II better than the canon lawyers. On the day that Pope John the 23rd announced the Second Vatican Council, he also announced a revision of the Code of Canon Law. And the committee that was put together and tasked with revising the Code of Canon Law knew that they needed to wait until the conclusion of the Second Vatican Council in order that the revision could take effect with the reflections and the commands of the Council Fathers after the conclusion of the Council. So they didn't begin working in earnest until 1965, when the Second Vatican Council was concluded. And you'll find all throughout the sources of the Second Vatican Council, or of the 1983 Code of Canon Law, that the Second Vatican Council is cited frequently in that, implementing the vision of Vatican II. And because I'm studying canon law, that's what you're going to hear an awful lot about, at least in the early parts when it comes to church governance. So we'll start talking about church governance right now. And what's interesting to note is that Vatican I never finished its work. It had planned documents on diocesan bishops, priests, religious, and the lay faithful. It had a much more ambitious scope. but only the document on the Pope and the document on faith and revelation were finished and promulgated. Those are both great documents right there. Especially the one on faith and revelation was quite timely in the and it's still worth reading today. But we only got the documents on the Pope, on the papal office and what the Pope does. And over time, that created a bit of an imbalance in the life of the church. There was kind of an excessive centralization of papal power to the detriment of the appropriate and proper prerogatives of especially the diocesan bishops. There was this idea that got codified in the 1917 Code of Canon Law that every 5 years bishops needed to write the Vatican asking for permission to have the faculties to do their job, basically. They're called the quinquennial faculties. The sense and some of the attitudes, some of the writings of theologians, you got the sense that bishops were merely branch managers of Catholic Incorporated, and the Pope was the CEO, and all of the bishops worked for the Pope. So that's just one instance where there were some things that could be changed, that could be updated, that could be balanced out with different writings about the different parts of the church. So Lumen Gentium was promulgated, I think, in 1964. And that is the document that is on the mystery of the church. Now, there was, proposed drafts of these documents, and the proposed drafts went very hierarchically. Talked about the Roman pontiff, talked about the bishops, talked about priests, talked about the religious, talked about the lay faithful. And the fathers at the Second Vatican Council ended up scrapping that draft. Instead of going to the hierarchical aspect of the church first, it looked at the church as a whole first and then examined the different parts. And so after the preamble, you get this extended meditation on the mystery of the church and the mission of the church in the world. It didn't get away from hierarchy. In fact, it was quite abundantly clear that there is a hierarchy within the Catholic Church, and that authority is given to the bishops in communion with the Roman pontiff for governing the Catholic Church. And that wasn't going away, but it's placed that hierarchy within the context of the whole church. It also made an emphasis on the fact that the mission of the church belongs to the whole church, with different members of the church having different types of participation in that church. So we'll do a little Code of Canon Law comparison. The 1917 Code of Canon Law gave the lay faithful the right to access the spiritual goods of the church necessary for salvation. That's good. If somebody has rights, they're not really chattel slaves. They are considered to be full members of society there. But that was kind of one of a few rights that the lay faithful were given in the 1917 code. By the time you get to the 1983 code, in the section in the early 200s of the canons, talks about the lay faithful having the obligation and the right to participate in the mission of the church. This was something in the revision of the code that they decided to emphasize and make that clear, even if it was only implicit before, and it probably was implicit before. This is now something that they were making explicit, that the lay faithful have the obligation and the right to participate in the mission of the church. They don't exist merely to be acted upon by the clergy or to support the clergy. And this reframing gave a greater clarity to what it means to be a pastor, what it means to be a priest and a bishop, that we, our ordination and our sacred ministry exists for the sake of building up and empowering the lay faithful to carry on their mission. So there was this renewed emphasis on the universal call to holiness, universal participation of the lay faithful in their church according to their state of life, and understanding clergy's part in equipping them and sending them out into the world in order to sanctify the entire human order. Uh, we got this lopsided focus on the power of the Roman pontiff, often at the expense of the diocesan bishops. Uh, so, Canon 81 of the 1917 Code dealt with the dispensation from universal laws. Uh, if a diocesan bishop wanted to give a dispensation from a universally applicable law from the Roman pontiff, he either needed to be given that permission by the law itself, or delegated that permission from the Roman pontiff, or to receive that permission from the Roman Curia. So there was a sense that, when the Roman pontiff would give an order, it needed to be followed, and there really wasn't much room to question that. And if you needed to question that, you would have to consult him directly for that. And this law was typical of the era. Like I had said previously, this gives a sense that the bishops are merely branch managers of Catholic Incorporated and the Pope and the CEO. And if you read what I consider to be otherwise quite worthy theological manuals of the era, something like the Fundamentals of Catholic Dogma by Ludwig Ott, which is in many respects an excellent manual to get you started with research into theology. Even in the theological manuals of the era, you get the sense that the holiness flowed down from God through the Pope into the bishops and priests, and then out into the world like that. As an imbalanced hierarchy, it's a little too top heavy. I'm a big fan of hierarchy and how things need to be governed with that way. The buck's got to stop somewhere. We're not trying to flatten the church out here, but things can't become too top heavy. And that was a sense among many theologians and canonists and just pastors in the church, was that in the decades between Vatican I and Vatican II, things have become a little too top heavy. Lumen Gentium, when it speaks about bishops, speaks first about there being a college of bishops, constituted in about the same way and after the same pattern as the College of the Apostles. So all of the apostles are given, authority to bind and loose on earth by Jesus, but St. Peter is given a certain primacy within the College of Apostles. He's always mentioned first in the Gospels. He was given the keys first, and he's usually the one who takes initiative throughout the Gospels and the Acts of the Apostles to do things. So he's got a certain primacy about him, but it's a primacy that exists within a college. He's the head of this collegial model there. So governance of the church is especially entrusted to the whole College of Bishops. The Pope still has a universal authority over it, but he's now understood to be as the head of the college rather than some sort of sui generis governor of the church, somebody who's so far above all the other bishops that he cannot be touched or questioned there. And I think the best way that this is understood is actually in Canon 87 of the 1983 Code of Canon Law. The bishop, the local diocesan bishop, has the ability to dispense universal laws for those over whom he governs, unless they are A, explicitly reserved to the Apostolic See, B, it's a penal law, or C, it's a procedural law. So the Pope still has the right to reserve a particular law to himself, but he needs to write that in there explicitly. If it's a penal law, the local bishop can't say, oh, well, that's not a canonical crime in my diocese. That's not good governance right there. And if it's a procedural law, well, that pertains to the protection of rights in the church. And so you can't just, not inform somebody that they're under investigation, not inform somebody that there's a trial going on, that they're being called to, those sorts of things like that. You can't dispense yourself from that. So you've got this real sense that the bishop is now being given by the law a fairly high degree of authority in his own diocese, that he, can dispense the faithful from these universal laws, which he doesn't see as being particularly effective for his place, without always having to consult the apostolic see there. So he's given a great degree of autonomy for his people while not being allowed to run roughshod over everything. So we could think of something like the formulas for performing a sacrament. I baptize you in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. That formula, the bishop cannot, that's been explicitly reserved to the apostolic see. He can't just dispense with that and substitute his own laws. And so usually the laws are written in such a way that those things which are most important and we wouldn't want some rogue bishop uh, causing trouble with, those laws are understood to be reserved to the apostolic see. Uh, I think this gives a good balance, and this is good for church governance here. There was also a re-emphasis on consultation as a way that the shepherds of the church are to proceed in governing the church. Now, consultation had always existed in the church, in formal and informal bodies. Um, the 1917 code directed bishops to hold diocesan synods every 10 years if it was possible. And each synod would have clerics and religious with a consultative vote. There were also ecumenical councils and regional councils, all of these being almost exclusively affairs of clerics. Now, certainly the works of those in the clerical states, bishops, priests, and deacons, certainly are very important to the life of the church. Um, but in the 1983 code, after the reflections of the Second Vatican Council, there was an expansion of the use of consultation within church governance. So in the 1983 code, the number of consultative bodies increased, as well as the number of times that they must be consulted for the validity of juridic acts. So on the diocesan level, you're now required to have a finance council and a priest council. It's commonly called the presbyteral council. And from the presbyteral council, you draw out the college of consultors, 6 to 12 priests that the bishop must consult on matters of great importance. The bishop also has the option of bringing together a diocesan pastoral council. Now, at the parish level, every parish is now required to have a finance council, somebody else taking a look at the books, make sure that they're not getting cooked, and to advise priests with a theology degree on how some of the more practical matters of church governance can go. And the priests or pastors are also able to have a pastoral council, although those are also, like at the diocesan level, optional consultative bodies. And most of these bodies have only consultative power. Um, Although on the diocesan level, the bishop occasionally needs their consent. And one particular place is that if the bishop is going to spend money over a certain limit, he needs to have the consent of both the finance council and the college of consultors. That gives a bit of a check on the bishop's authority to uh, spend money, because I think it's in six figures. It might actually even be in seven. I haven't looked at the number recently, but that kind of expenditure, if it's not done prudently, um, it can seriously affect the life of a diocese for decades to come. In most other cases, the bishop is required to get a consultative vote from these different bodies, from the finance council, from the presbyteral council, or from the college of consultors. And this right here is a really excellent way of governing, is that you've got a certain number of people who are committed to the mission and have a certain stake in the game. And you've got one person who is tasked as being the leader, but they're given uh, this directive that they need to consult with other people whilst they're making these decisions that affect, we'll say, the whole of the diocese. We don't want to have just one person up there who's expected to have all of the knowledge and expertise inside their head and that flows out through them, but rather a collaborative effort. But the buck still stops at one point. It doesn't get rid of the monarchical uh, model of the church, but it does, hopefully, if it's used well, give whoever's in charge of a particular region, the pastor, the diocese, uh, a little bit of consultation there. This also exists for the Roman pontiff. They came up with the Synod of Bishops, which is not nearly as big of a to do as an ecumenical council, but it's a consultative body that the Roman pontiffs have been making use of ever since the Second Vatican Council. So, in these, the and church governance, making it explicit that the laity have a right to participate in the mission of the church, um, giving proper power of governance back to the local bishops and these bodies of consultation. I think these are all excellent developments that come straight from Vatican II in the practice of governance within the church. And that's not a complete breakdown of it. Those are just things that I think are very, very relevant and very worth speaking about. So that concludes church governance. We're going to move on to church-state relationships. There was a document, Dignitatis Humanae, that talked about the relationship between the church and the state. Now, the church over the centuries have gotten accustomed to what we can call integralism. You might also hear that as an altar and throne arrangement. Basically, there being a certain joint participation between church and state for the interest of promoting the church's interests. Uh, for centuries, this was just the intuitive way that people thought of, that things should be organized. So, having the Pope crowned the Holy Roman Emperor just made perfect sense to people. Um, with the advent of these secular governments, which didn't have any particular denominational or church affiliation, that model began to change and it began to not be practiced. And during the 19th century, the popes reacted strongly against it. They were very formally saying that this integralism is the proper ordering of things. And they explicitly taught in encyclicals and such that whenever possible, integralism should be promoted and worked towards. Now, that makes things a little bit difficult for Catholics who happen to live in, let's say, a representative democracy, who don't have a monarch that they can just hope becomes a Christian, but instead participate in a democratic process. There was this real sense that Catholics couldn't be trusted with high office because of their affiliation with a Roman pontiff, and this idea that the Roman pontiff might begin dictating policy to, we'll say, Americans when they are in a high office there against the interest of Americans. And the way they would make these arguments wasn't just by making stuff up, but they would point at the writings of certain Roman pontiffs, Gregory the 16th, Pius the Ninth, Leo the 13th, and say, look, you guys can't really participate in democracy because your leaders are telling us that um, everybody, we need to have a Catholic state everywhere. And a lot of times there's also a fair bit of monarchism from the French influence, but America's never really been a place for monarchy. We're just, kind of grinds against our national self-understanding. So, Dignitatis Humanae is the Vatican II's Declaration on Religious Liberty. And it's a bit of a confusing document. And if you've read that and you get very puzzled, because it seems to be trying to hold two things at balance. There's one particular part near the beginning of it that says, this declaration leaves unchanged the traditional doctrine about the duties of the state towards the church. Nevertheless, We now proclaim that human beings are should be entirely without coercion from the state when it comes to um, choosing their religious affiliation. It begins to say all sorts of very nice things about religious freedom to the point where you're like, well, how is this compatible with the traditional doctrine of the duties of the state towards the church? And it doesn't really answer that question satisfactorily. Members of the SSPX, who are pretty close to schism with the church. They say that this is a doctrinal error, and this is their source of saying that the Second Vatican Council is spurious or invalid, or at least greatly to be questioned. And I don't think their arguments hold water, but I do think that this particular argument about Dignitatis Humanae is their strongest argument. So we've got this rather muddled and confused document, at least in my opinion. Maybe you're smarter than me and you can just figure it out. In which case, come on one of my Monday night streams and straighten me out. That would be a good thing. Um, what I think this really did is it opened up space to participate for Catholics to participate in public life. When there was this perception that the church was opening up a little bit and at the very minimum, having this as a prudential policy, right? That, okay, we can encourage well formed Catholic men and women to participate in the governance of the place where they live. That's a good thing. And we should go ahead and encourage that. So, at least as a prudential policy, encouraging Catholics to participate in democracy in a new way, I think was a good thing. And, we can hang our hats on the fact that right near the beginning of the document it says it leaves unchanged the traditional doctrine of the duties of states towards the church. Maybe we can hope for a better day when there can be some amount of acknowledgement of God from secular governments. That's all another fascinating talk that we could talk about. Leave a comment down below if you'd like to hear more about that kind of stuff, because I've thought about it a fair bit. But I think that's enough to say about church-state relations. Gave Catholics a little bit of maneuvering room within a secular democracy to do that whilst still being good and faithful Catholics. The next topic is ecumenism. This idea of ecumenism is that we are trying to get all of these different Christian denominations back together. That the scandal of the division among those who claim to be Christ's followers is something that we should be working to um, to remedy and rectify. Prior to Vatican II, the Roman pontiffs were rather suspicious of these different ecumenical movements, and they weren't entirely without reason to be skeptical. Many of these efforts were entirely mindset in operation, or entirely Protestant in their mindset, in their operation, and in their membership. And there's a certain way that, with the Protestant theories of church polity, that they can be much more free in sharing communion in a way that Catholics cannot. Um, so the Vatican document Unitatis Redintegratio opened up space for Catholics to not only participate in ecumenical efforts, but actually directed us to start leading them and to take active leadership in these things. And the document is astonishingly clear that uh, settled doctrine is not up for debate, that we are not going to be going to these ecumenical gatherings. We're not going to be leading these ecumenical efforts in order that, we can start getting a little bit of Protestant doctrine in here and a little bit of Orthodox doctrine in here. We're going to syncretistically mix it all up together and end up with the Orange Catholic Bible in order that there would be something for everybody to give and to take in there. That is not the vision of Unitatis Redintegratio. Instead, it's very serious that we're not going to these ecumenical gatherings with Protestants and Orthodox in order to change doctrine, but in order to present Catholic doctrine in a deep and faithful way, and hopefully come to a greater understanding about where the foundations of our differences come from. There's this idea that we can slowly, maybe decade by decade, maybe over the course of centuries, come to a point where, after all the dialogue, after the possibility of new understandings, we might even be able to get into a position of institutional unity. But this understanding that this would not be something that's accomplished quickly, and that we are not going to be leaving settled doctrine up for debate. Now, some theologians, some priests, some people participating in ecumenical dialogue in the aftermath of the Second Vatican Council didn't really seem to take this seriously, but it's hard to fault the Council Fathers for that when the document that they actually voted on was very clear there. And I think this was useful because it helps cool the tension between denominations. Uh, there used to be a lot more suspicion and hatred between the denominations, and that's the heat's been turned down on that in the decades since Vatican II. And I think that's at least in part due to the fact that Catholics are now leading ecumenical endeavors instead of just suspiciously eyeing them from a distance. And hopefully, this can help us get to the real root of our differences without engaging in propaganda, but really understanding each other as a hopeful first step towards some kind of institutional unity and reintegration. And a final topic for this little rant is on interreligious dialogue. There was this desire to not only begin to speak in a deeper way with other Christians, but also to have dialogue with various religious groups in the world. It's got a different form and a different different goals, right? So we're not seeking a institutional unity with any Muslim groups, with any Jewish groups, with any Hindu or Buddhist groups or anything like that. That's not the goal of that, but we can still come to a greater understanding. And if we send the best of our best out there, we might be able to proclaim the gospel in a way that people might be able to hear it. And it's another forum for doing that. And again, as with the Rede Integratis, Unitatis Rede Integratio, Nostra Aetate was quite clear that we are not to compromise on doctrine. And I think specifically, the Nostra Aetate was able to give one particular condemnation of an idea, of a practice that had existed for centuries and probably needed to be cleared up. This idea that the Jews of today ought to be held accountable for the death of Christ. Now, I'm not sure if the Roman pontiff or any gathering of bishops had ever taught that formally. I don't know if that was ever a doctrine that we would have to contend with as having any kind of magisterial weight, but it was certainly something that was widely believed and practiced. And the Second Vatican Council condemned that idea that we need to continually punish people alive today for something that was conspired by a small group of people in Jerusalem centuries ago. The church decided that we'd had enough of that and we were going to put a stop to it. And in fairly strong language and unambiguous clarity, said that we cannot hold the Jews of today accountable for the death of Christ. So I think that was an important thing and something that I don't particularly want to go back on. So that's all the topics that we talked about we were going to cover today. And what I've gone over is certainly not the entirety of the council, just parts that I think are relevant and parts that I would hope that we would hang on to. And most of these changes that we see from the Vatican Council have just become an accepted part of the furniture for Catholics. All of these things that I've talked about, as I learned about them, they just seemed normal to me because I'm a product of the Second Vatican Council. I grew up in the post Vatican II church, and I was formed in a great many ways by the doctrines of the Second Vatican Council. And most of that I'm quite happy about. I think a lot of these things that the Second Vatican Council has accomplished are valuable and should be celebrated. So that's why I don't like it when people ask me if I accept or condemn Vatican II. Uh, I've got questions about the liturgical changes. I uh, have the opportunity to celebrate the traditional Latin Mass, and I do so, and I do so, and I enjoy it. And I'm a little troubled by the restrictions that have been placed on it recently. And I wish that this was something that we could speak openly and freely about without having to call into question the entirety of everything that Vatican II was able to accomplish. I think it accomplished an awful lot of good things. And because of the visibility of the liturgical changes, I'm afraid that we would end up throwing out the baby with the bathwater if we were in our questions and concerns about the Reformed liturgies, if we were to reject Vatican II wholesale. So when people say, well, I condemn and reject Vatican II, they're only thinking about the liturgy stuff. I think that's schismatic talk. And I don't want to do any schisms. No more schism. We've had enough of that. Uh, and so I offer this video as my contribution in praise of Vatican II. I think Vatican II accomplished a lot of good things. Let me know if there's something you want to learn more about. You can drop a comment down there. Otherwise, if you've made it to the end of this video, thank you for your time and attention.